I mean, for me as a mom, you look at your kids, you look at the world of toxic soup that we're raising them in, and there's just nothing more important to me, minerals and a healthy diet and nourishing foods. But this idea of cellular resilience in the world that we're in today, I think is so important. And I'm learning so much more just about how many things affect our health and how they affect our health. And so the more I can prioritize that as a mother, but also as kind of an educator to help more people understand this concept is really my mission.
Jessica Kane, thank you so much for coming on the Dr. Tina Show. I'm so excited to have you here. We are going to be talking all about BodyBio. You're the Chief Medical Officer, and we're going to be talking about GLP1s and brain health and all kinds of fun stuff. So thanks for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I was introduced to your company a few years back by our mutual friend, Dr. John Kim, who has been on my podcast a few times for my audience. If they haven't heard his interviews, go back and listen to those. He's so funny because every single time I've come to him with any kind of health issue, you and I were talking offline. I'm like, hey, John, what do you think of this? And he's like, cellular health, cellular membrane health, BodyBio. So I'm really excited to pick your brain today because I have many questions.
I'm very excited to have the conversation. I truly believe my grandparents started the company 35 years ago. I truly believe that cellular health is so much a part of our conversation now, just due to the world that we live in, right? The world that we're living in today is so much different than it ever has been, and it's more toxic, and we really need to build the cellular resilience. So that's why so many people who've been through such extreme health issues, such as John, have kind of found the way and learned so much about maintaining cellular health.
Yeah. So tell me about the brand. How did this start with your grandfather?
Yeah, so it started 35 years ago. My grandparents were fatty acid researchers, and they were doing research for, about 40 years. And it really brought them to a precipice in kind of the 1990s where they were training practitioners on different forms of lipid replacement therapy and how it could work therapeutically for neurodegeneration or children with rare epilepsy disorders or children with autism. And what they really found was phospholipids, bioactive lipids, butyrate, short chain fatty acids, electrolytes can assist in really optimizing neurometabolic health. And so they developed the product line from this kind of research that they were doing and the trainings that they were doing, and started to work on the product line, which came about in about the late 1990s.
Okay. Well, that is so fascinating because just as a side note, when I was a teenager, I really struggled with depression and anxiety. And it also coincided with a pretty severe eating disorder. And I've been open about this with my audience. And what I found through my journey through naturopathic medical school and through chiropractic college was how helpful fats were for me. And I was embracing the fats long before most of my colleagues. And I took a lot of heat for it. And I knew there was more to it than just the omega-6s and the omega-3s and the seed oils. And, we called them omega-6s at the time, but really, incorporating saturated fats into my life made such a profound difference for me and my brain health overall and my mental outlook. And then really kind of deep diving into that phospholipid membrane and understanding that I'm sure you understand it even more deeply than I do, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about the cellular membrane. What is it and why are fats so important? Because I came out of the era, I don't know how old you are, but I came out of the like low fat, no fat era, and everybody went batshit crazy because we were all being fed fake fats and Olestra and, Pam spray on oil and all that garbage.
Margarine.
Yes. I can't believe it's not butter. I distinctly remember the moment we went from lard in my family to I can't believe it's not butter. And I went crazy. That's when I went south. That's when my mental health went south, was when my mom started cooking with that. And I started eating that crappy fake fat. So I'm a big fan of the real fats and the fatty acids, but let's tell the audience, what is a cellular membrane made out of? Because I don't think they realize how important fats are for us.
It's made out of fats. Mostly phospholipids. The cell membrane is a lipid bilayer. So it's like this two kind of layer of phospholipids, different phospholipids on the inner layer versus the outer layer. 50% of the outer layer is comprised of phosphatidylcholine. You have saturated fats, you have ion channels and peptide channels. You have different, minerals and things like the electron transport chain. I mean, there's so many different beautiful things that happen on the membrane. One of my favorite, I don't know what he wouldn't be called a researcher, but Bruce Lipton talks about the fact that the membrane is responsible for the actions of the cell. So your DNA is like a blueprint. It doesn't actually perform any action. And so if you have this leaky cell membrane and this cell membrane that's kind of like a raisin, and instead of it being a grape, you're going to have issues with neurotransmission and the activities that cell is supposed to be performing. And what my grandparents really found is that you can normalize the structure of your cell membrane by optimizing your cellular health with phospholipids and bioactive lipids, like pure forms of omega-3 and 6, linoleic and alpha linolenic, really important for cellular fluidity and cellular structure, the cell membrane.
Absolutely. And you mentioned phosphatidylcholine. Do you want to talk about that for a minute? Because I think that is such a critically important element to our diets, and that it's so important that we take it in. And when people throw egg yolks out, I want to scream. And I want to explain to the audience why that is.
It's people are removing, there's such a myopic view on linoleic acid that they're removing things like egg yolks, thinking that you're decreasing your linoleic acid intake. And so you're getting less phospholipids, phosphatidylcholine. Eggs are one of the main sources, things like soy are other sources, meats even, but they're demyelinating. You're removing so much that you're actually reversing your health. And so this kind of myopic view of omega-6 is a whole different conversation. Right. But to focus on phosphatidylcholine, it's a critically important fat, essentially an oil, if you will, because fats are going to be solid. It's a bioactive lipid. It's this beautiful part of the cell membrane that we synthesize in our bodies from food. We typically start to lose the ability to synthesize it from food as we age. And it's critically important to our cellular health. So if the majority of the outside of your cell membrane starts to kind of deteriorate, that not only affects your cells, but it affects all the organelles within the cells, like the mitochondria.
Yes, yes. And the cell is my undergrad focus really was on cell biology, and it's such an intricate world in there. And we need these fatty acids, these appropriate fatty acids, for all of it to work, for all of it to flow. And like you said, when we're ingesting a bunch of, this whole generation has been basically raised up on crappy fats, and it makes those cells so rigid. And everyone says we're made of proteins, and I'm like, yeah, but we function on fats. Like that's
absolutely, and especially the brain.
Yeah. And all the signaling and the G proteins inside just for the audience to understand, that phospholipid bilayer is just chock full of receptors and channels. And all of those receptors and channels work best and only really appropriately when these fatty acids, the appropriate fatty acids, are made available. So otherwise things just kind of go to hell in a handbasket.
The other thing that can happen that's really interesting is toxins can affect the location of those channels and those receptor sites and the composition of the phospholipids within both the cell membrane and like the mitochondrial membrane. And so toxins will literally attach, like currently I'm dealing with mold in my HVAC. So these toxins, these different molds will then also grab onto things like heavy metals, and they attach themselves to our nuclear and mitochondrial DNA, and they create these DNA adducts. And what PC and balance oil and butyrate works as an HGAC inhibitor, but it also works as a chemical chaperone to kind of break down these toxins. But it's really those products together that optimize our neurometabolic and cellular health to detoxify these things. So they're not sticking to our DNA, because everything, the testing that I'm doing recently, triclosan, every single car exhaust fumes. It picks up everything. And it's not like I'm working on old cars or using hand sanitizer all the time. So these things stick to our DNA and they affect us at that epigenetic level. And I think there's so much interesting research going on, particularly in the functional and integrative space, on how these things then trigger disease and disease at younger states.
Absolutely. And you can't fix anything. I mean, you can take all the fancy things in the world and you can't fix anything unless that cell membrane is signaling and working appropriately and channeling correctly and all of that jazz. So I really do think it is ground zero for folks who, especially the folks who like, I've done everything. And it's like, yeah,
And I'm still not feeling well. Yeah.
yeah, we still have this weird, even in the functional medicine space and in the naturopathic world, we still have this sort of like kill the offending things, detox the offending things, which I get, but like, how about we avoid the offending things as best we can? And like you and I were talking offline, it's just unavoidable in our current world. I mean, a lot of these toxins are just there. It's just inherent to, we live in a toxic soup is what I call it. Like the planet has turned into a big bowl of toxic soup, and
Yeah.
each individual has their sort of toxic bucket load they have, filled. And while we can try as hard as we can to avoid as much of these things, and certainly getting rid of the hand sanitizers and the overt offenders, but then there's just this sort of rebuild that we got to do. And I think that's where John has really like evangelized me to understand your product line around this, because I'm not seeing anyone else talk about this.
It's
really
about nourishing. And I don't think we talk about that enough in
Yeah.
this field, right? I think when people are dealing with chronic illness, you're dealing with Lyme or mold toxicity or something just really, and they're really ill and they're in a state of cell danger response and chronic inflammatory response syndrome. To just kill and remove, there needs to be the element of nourishing at that foundational cellular level.
Yeah. We were talking about that offline as well before, you and I, this idea that we're going to get into postbiotics and sodium butyrate, but people want to, first they want to dial in their diet, which is of course step one and very critically important. Obviously looking at the environment we live in and the homes we live in and the places we live, but there's only so much we can do about that often.
Yeah.
I just tested my house for mold and got back the test results, and it's not enough to start ripping walls out, but there's something there, right? So, and I live in Oregon. I mean, come on, it rains all the time and it's like everything molds eventually around here. And then it's a matter of, to me, I've always tried to talk to patients, I'm not as concerned about killing everything off and removing everything as I am making the individual more resilient so that they can withstand these onslaughts. And that's the name of the game, in my opinion. So I think cellular health is a keystone to that. And mitochondrial health and the mitochondrial membrane health. That's the way to get through this, because we can't always control what we're going to get hit with and where we're going to be. And that's the best we can do, is build a robust system inside.
Exactly. Yeah. That's really the approach. I mean, it's the approach for adults. It's the approach for children. That is the BodyBio protocol in essence.
I love it. So I want to hear more about your grandfather, because this guy sounds fascinating. So is your grandfather and your grandmother were both?
Yeah, they're fatty acid researchers. He was like a biohacker before the term ever even existed. In the 1980s, he was a serial entrepreneur. One of his first jobs out of college, he moved down to Miami and was selling papayas and papaya like enzymes that he like made on the street.
Oh
Literally,
my gosh.
he just was like into it, and he knew there was something to it for health benefits. And in the 1980s, he had heavy metal poisoning because he had a steel factory. And that was our family business. That's what his parents did. And they had a steel yard. He opened up a steel factory, had heavy metal toxicity, was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, and just was not willing to take that at face value. Was not going to say like, okay, this is how I'm going to live the rest of my life. And so he really went on this mission to figure out how he could feel better and then help other people.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love this. Okay. So we are going to talk today a bit deep dive into sodium butyrate, and because it's so important and it ties in to the GLP-1 conversation I've been having on my podcast lately, and people are really getting into it. And I did a short podcast recently talking about how berberine was not nature's Ozempic and sodium butyrate is not either, but what they are, and what I think sodium butyrate has actually a multitude beyond. Berberine has some really nice impacts, but I think sodium butyrate might be the most efficacious of these. They're GLP-1 inducers or signalers. They potentiate the cells in our body naturally occurring to make our own endogenous GLP-1. Can you talk about what sodium butyrate is, where it's made in the body, why it's so important? Let's start there.
Sodium butyrate is really cool. It's technically, this new term that they're still really defining of a postbiotic. It's a short chain fatty acid that's biosynthesized in the colon. And it's essentially a molecule that is produced by specific bacteria when they eat specific fibers. So resistant starches are the most popular. I was talking recently about a study that was done out of the University of Leeds in England recently. And I think it was last year. And it was a 20-year study on over 1,000 people. And they gave them a green banana a day. And they looked at the data and there was a 60% reduction in total body cancers. Well, why a green banana? It's a resistant starch. And what does that do in the gut? It produces butyrate. So we do not eat green bananas. We don't eat plantains. We don't even eat enough fiber. I mean, the typical American diet has like no fiber in it anymore. And so we're seeing this like systemic low levels of butyrate. I mean, I rarely hear that people do a gut test and say like, oh, I have ample levels of short chain fatty acid production. It's just uncommon. And I think combined with the use, rampant use of antibiotics, combined with herbicides and pesticides that affect our gut microbiome, we are lacking in the bacteria that produce butyrate. We're lacking in the foods that those bacteria need. And butyrate is such a critically important molecule in the gut for so many reasons. It's the main food source of the colonocytes in the gut. They have a really fast turnover, so they need that food. It's extremely anti-inflammatory in the gut. It's responsible for telling immune cells what type of immune functions to act out. On other levels from the gut, it has systemic benefits from its role as an HGAC inhibitor, histone deacetylase. It basically determines the role, like the way our DNA is coiled and how that is transcribed. Its role as a chemical chaperone, breaking down toxins that attach to your nuclear and mitochondrial DNA. It's fascinating. I mean, there's so much going on with butyrate, there was a great study that came out of Columbia University and the NIH is working on its role in chronic fatigue syndrome. There's some incredible studies that came out this year looking at pediatric obesity. And, this is a population that probably cannot take semaglutide and may not be appropriate for them for, a multitude of reasons, but there's natural ways that they can go about inducing and influencing the secretion of GLP1.
Yes, exactly. My whole jam is that we start with natural stuff first. We add in what we need. We pull out the big guns as needed, right? But really focusing predominantly, and I think this is where people get severely off track. And I've said this before on the podcast, the folks using GLP-1 agonists, the drug version, which is the peptides alone, and not doubling down on an insulin sensitive lifestyle, not doubling down on healing their gut, getting their emunctories ready to lose fat, getting their emunctories ready to detoxify. If you don't have all the right cofactors and you don't have all the right molecules in place, I think that's why we're seeing trouble with the use of these drugs. And you're absolutely right. I don't think it's a first line for anyone. I don't think they're a first line, especially for children. I do think that if they are being used, though, that people could do a whole lot better with their lifestyle and their overall health and use them as tools to get that lifestyle piece dialed. Right. And then using these supplements and whatever adjunctive treatments we need as sort of icing on the cake, because I think, again, that's why people are withdrawing from these drugs, getting off of them and gaining all the weight back. I'm like, well, you never
your lifestyle.
Yeah. You never dealt with your insulin resistance. You just turned it down with a drug and then it turned back on the minute you go off of it. And I just think there's a better way. I think getting this endogenous production as dialed in as we can, and endogenous for the listeners means your body's making it. Our body makes GLP-1, like you were saying, and we need certain nutrients to do that. And that's where I had a professor tell me once in naturopathic school, he said, death starts in the colon, like straight up. And so day one of graduating and opening my practice, I ran gut tests on every single patient, whether they presented with gut issues or not. I didn't care. I was like, I want to see what your gut's doing, because if death starts in the colon, we got to figure out what your gut's doing. And you're right. Nobody had enough short chain fatty acids. we are dealing with a epidemic of low production. And whether it's because they're not ingesting or things aren't working right there, or the cells aren't signaling correctly, but it's a big one.
Yeah,
and then
it's a product for us that was not, I mean, it wasn't an ancillary product, but it was an important product. It was kind of during COVID times that it like switched, like people started just paying attention to their gut health so much more. And in the last 5 years, it's grown 500% for us. I mean, it's just incredible. It was something that I think was very difficult to understand to a general audience, but there's so many more of us taking our health into our own hands, taking our health so much more seriously, being our own advocates, our own educators. And it's grown exponentially, not only for our practitioner business, but our direct to consumer business, because a lot of people have been failed by, I think, the probiotic industry and how many claims that they've made. And it's not necessarily helping.
It's true. And there are some folks like myself who can't handle high doses of probiotics. They tear me apart, and they say, oh, you just got to get past that. And there was never any getting past it in some cases. And many of my patients who had inflammatory bowel disease or really severe IBS, probiotics were just like fire. It was just like lighter fluid on the fire, I should say. And what I would tell them back then, the butyrate I had been exposed to up until your product line was pretty stinky stuff. And yours is not so stinky.
It's still stinky, but it's not as stinky.
No, it's not as stinky.
Although I will say I have other forms in the works. So there's a form that I'm working on that's going to have no stink whatsoever. And it's encapsulated in lipid beadlets, so children will be able to take it, which is so
wonderful. Well, that takes me back to what I was saying. I always told patients, take this. Butyrate is like a balm for your colon. That's what I would tell them. I know we talk about it as fuel for the colonocytes, but I think of it as like the soothing balm. Yeah. So when the gut's really irritated, butyrate is a lovely, lovely balm, in my opinion. And that's how I would get patients to take it, because it didn't always induce an acute reaction where like they take it, they'd feel better. In many cases it can. For me, it does. When I take it, my gut feels way better pretty fast. But in some patients, like, why am I doing this again? Because in their heads, they wanted the upstream. They wanted the kill off all the bad stuff. And I'm like, how about we shift your biome with diet, and then we apply a balm? I
like that.
That's kind of how I at least verbalized it, to get people to understand my sense. Because if you take an inflamed gut, or you take somebody who's dealing with a really severe inflammatory process, my mom has Crohn's. My entire side of her family has been my grandmother died of it. My uncle died of it. Crohn's is in the family. And then on her dad's side, there's ulcerative colitis. And so I'm like, take care of your gut early. Do not get to the point where I got. Most of us get to the point where the wheels are falling off, and then we go to a functional medicine practitioner to try to fix, right the ship. And often they start with, and this is one of the reasons I don't love high dosing berberine, because berberine it's a microbiome killer, really, when you think about it. We've most often utilized it in my practice to bring down, abnormal bacterial counts in patients' guts. And so while it works on the metabolism, it also is, most notably an antibacterial substance. And so finding something that has a similar impact, that is not going to be such a balm on the gut, that's what I'm looking for.
I was talking to John last night about thoughts on taking berberine and butyrate together.
Oh yeah.
Because you get, if berberine's kind of a little bit of action similar to metformin, butyrate has tiny action similar to a semaglutide, Ozempic. I wonder what the two of them together would look like. It's an interesting.
Well, I often had patients on both, because I was treating the front end. I was trying to reestablish a more normal microbiome. So we were, removing the offenders with the berberine, and using the berberine for blood sugar balance, because everybody has some level of metabolic dysfunction, especially if they're walking into my clinic feeling crummy. I'm guessing they're going to, and their labs would definitely show that. But then, that was always part of the protocol, because I was trying to hit the front end of the gut and the back end of the gut. So that was I would use
something I can explore.
Oh yeah. But that's the thing, you got to have the balm. If you just keep bringing down the bacterial counts with stuff that kills it off, and then especially if you're throwing probiotics at it, I'm not trying to dismiss probiotics, but if you're throwing a lot of probiotics at it, you got to do something to calm down the spasms and the tail end of the track, if you will.
I like to say it like makes a happy house for the probiotics to live in, right? In a
Oh.
way, it helps seal those tight junctions. It helps to seal leaky gut. I think there's just so many different roles that it plays in the gut, but the anti-inflammatory is particularly important for butyrate.
Yes, that's it. So for everyone listening, we need the anti-inflammatory. That's the name of the game. All right, I have other questions here about this. Talk about the HDAC inhibition. What is that? So people understand what that means. I know you mentioned a little bit about DNA, but I've read about it mostly for cancer.
Yeah, I mean, they're really studying this a lot. It's responsible for determining how tightly coiled our DNA is.
Okay.
And so therefore, it's looking at how much of it is transcribed into RNA. So it supports us on the genetic level by protecting the DNA wrapped around proteins called histones.
Okay.
So confusing, very scientific stuff. You can look up an HDAC inhibitor. It's getting into the talk of it being a drug. So we'll avoid that.
Yeah.
You know, FDA disclaimer, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with the role that it plays as an HDAC inhibitor.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that. We don't want to go too sciencey. We've got a lot of practitioners listening to the show, but there's a lot of just general public. And my podcast producer will always tease me. He's like, so that one went above my pay scale. I have no idea what you guys were talking about. So we got to make sure Drake understands this.
I try to keep it, I try to keep things, it's my job in marketing is specifically to take all this very technical information. I remember when I first sat down with my grandparents and looking at my grandfather and saying, tell me what butyrate is. We used to run this ad that said, feed your microbiome the right stuff. That's not what butyrate is. It took me years of sitting with him to figure out exactly what butyrate is. And now people have ChatGPT and AI and they can ask it all sorts of questions. But when I was trying to distill this very difficult information from these researcher brains into layman's terms of like, how will people relate to this? It really took a lot of work. And I think part of what we've done is we educate a lot and we utilize the practitioners that we work with to help us educate as much as possible just on the importance of things like postbiotic butyrate.
Right. And taking it back to GLP-1, it doesn't directly communicate with GLP-1, but it changes how those cells that produce GLP-1 operate so that they do a better job. And that's where a lot of folks are busted. I see online, there's so much hate around Ozempic, and I get why. And I also think, in the online space, you have to be polarizing to get people's attention. And so everyone's jumping on the I hate Ozempic bandwagon. And their biggest argument is that people don't have an Ozempic deficiency. And I'm like, actually, people do have GLP-1 deficiencies.
Yeah.
It's a thing. And there's deficiencies in the brain, there's deficiencies in the gut. And it's because their gut cells are not working appropriately because of all the things you just mentioned. It might be years of abuse from poor diet. I think with these children that we're seeing, I mean, gosh, that's a whole other podcast of the state of children's health in this country.
Yeah.
But they're, from the get-go, they're not getting appropriate dietary intake from birth. I mean, from preconception. And I'm not putting any blame on the moms. I get it. But man, these poor kids are not getting a good start in many cases. And we wonder why they're obese. And we're trying to treat them on this. Again, it's like people trying to put out the fire, but not looking at what's stoking the fire. And
we're so behind on this. And I think, I was talking recently with somebody about the fact that the fertility issues that I'm seeing, I'm 40, it's rampant. And it's not because we're having children later. It is a epidemic. It is a huge problem. The way people are, just thinking that all these fertility issues are normal, or that our children's speech delays are normal, or the rates of autism. I mean, these are big problems that we need to be having serious conversations about. We always approach it from, there's a protocol that we actually have for preconception, utilizing butyrate, PC, balance oil. I mean, it's really pretty simple, but using those things to do cellular detoxification so that you're as healthy as possible, and then utilizing tons of those healthy fats and oils, the bioactive lipids, the butyrate, not the butyrate, the PC and balance oil during pregnancy. And I'd really like to start seeing if we can put together a consortium of doctors and offices that we can start doing some trials and really seeing the data there with people who use it during pregnancy.
That's huge. That's so huge. I was in very poor health going into pregnancy. I was completely unprepared for it. I got pregnant by accident and was probably the unhealthiest I've ever been in my life. I was chain smoking, I was drinking, I was eating garbage. I just was not in a good place. And I got pregnant, and I joke that I have an autoimmune disease condition called ITP, which is low platelet count. My body eats my platelets, or did anyway, when I was in poor health. And my platelets were so terribly low during pregnancy that my mentor, who was a naturopath of many, many decades, Dr. Rick Marinelli, he put me on, I hate to say this now, but he put me on just gobs of shark liver oil. And I felt so bad about it at the time because I was a vegetarian. That was part of my terrible health. And I was, it's not nice how they get the shark liver oil. And I'm not proud of that, but it saved me and it got my platelet counts up. And we don't necessarily know how shark liver oil does that. I bet if I go back and look at some data, I could probably piece it together better now, decades later. But I joke with my daughter, I'm like, that was your saving grace, is you got pounded with, and he got me on basically steak and shark liver oil. And I was like, well, at least we were getting a lot of good fatty acids into the system to build that brain and to build like you said, the neuronal sheaths. My grandfather died of multiple sclerosis. So that was another reason I took to fatty acid interest in school when I was in school, because I was like, man, this demyelination thing is no joke. And I don't want that. And how do I avoid that? And again, I had come out of the Olestra. Do you remember Olestra? Are you old enough to?
Yeah.
I came out of that whole group. And when I was a teenager, heroin chic, skinny was the look, right? So we were all just starving ourselves to death. But unfortunately, we were starving ourselves of fats and we were all going crazy. So I came right out of that and got pregnant. So you can imagine the state my body was in. And my daughter is, for all intents, quite healthy, but man, I joke. I'm like, I was pounding the shark liver oil, girl. We should get on that and find out what's in there, because that was a big one. So talk more about what a postbiotic is for people, because we keep mentioning that. I want people to really understand what that means.
It's essentially a byproduct of a balanced microbiome. So you have your prebiotics, that's like the food. I like to think of it as if you think of it in terms of like a flower, your actual plant, the flower, or we'll say the plant, is the probiotics. The water, sun is your prebiotics, and the flowers, fruits, and vegetables are your postbiotics. So the byproduct of that healthy plant are your postbiotics.
I like that. That's great. That's a good way to put it. And sodium butyrate is a postbiotic. So it helps heal and seal up that leaky gut and get that colon back into optimal function.
Yeah, it is. And, there's some companies making bacteria that produce postbiotics. There's some people that say taking oral postbiotics don't make it to the colon and don't work. They do. We know that from 35 years of manufacturing them. And we're doing some really interesting clinical trials. We're doing a clinical trial with the VA starting next year, which is very exciting. We're doing a clinical trial with Dr. Terry Walls at the University of Iowa. And so we know the efficacy of these things. It's really just about therapeutic versus maintenance doses and how much people need. I personally take a ton of postbiotics. I've always leaned towards gut health problems. Growing up, I had low stomach acid production. So in my early 20s, before my grandfather got his hands on me, I was taking the Nexium and the Prilosec and doing all these endoscopies, and I have a hiatal hernia. And, I sat down with him one day in San Diego, oddly, and we went to go to get tacos. And I said, I can't eat tacos. He said, here, take an HCl, take a magnesium carbonate 45 minutes later, take some butyrate before bed. And it changed my life. I couldn't eat anything before that. And so really getting to this functional root cause approach to my health changed the outcome of my gut health in particular. So I use postbiotics. I use it for anti-inflammatory, reasons. I use it to just decrease GI inflammation, keeps me regular, great added bonus. And I use it for blood sugar balance. So I use it after meals to help with that blood sugar regulation. Before I had my 3 healthy children, we have a 2, a 4, and a 6-year-old. Back. I went to a doctor and they said, you're pre-diabetic. I'm going to put you on metformin. Here's a prescription for Clomid. This is the only way you're going to be able to have a baby. So of course I left. I called my grandfather. He said, no, you've got to fix your diet. I was living in England. I was not really, focusing. I was in my 20s. I wasn't focusing on my health. And even though I knew what to do for my digestive health, because he had taught me that in my early 20s, I didn't understand the role that insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity plays in all of our health. And so I really started taking that seriously. I had no issues whatsoever getting pregnant.
It's wild. I had so many patients come in the exact same state that you're describing. They were in their mid to late 20s and they were dealing with infertility issues. And I would always tell them, as we started to rebuild their gut, get their thyroid working, get their, and you need your gut working to get all these other things working. That's the caveat. You can take all the hormones in the world, or you can try to balance your hormones all you want. You're not going to get anywhere if your gut isn't in good shape. And I would always tell them, be careful, because your good or your poor health has been your birth control, and straight up. So if you get pregnant, be warned, because you very well could. And it was always so unfortunate, because I successfully helped a lot of women get pregnant in practice. And then they'd go off to their OBGYN and they would say, oh, don't take any of those supplements. Don't do any of that, because we don't know what they do. We don't know, because they were not well educated in them, of course. And they'd say, oh, we don't know what that's going to do to the fetus. So stop. And sadly, some women listened and lost their pregnancies. And I was just like, oh, it's a cycle. But going back, I just wanted to mention this. You sparked my memory. When I went in, my audience knows this, in 2021, my psoriatic arthritis flared and I went pretty strict carnivore. It actually wasn't anything new to me. That was something I used in clinical practice for well over a decade. I would put people on a high beef diet, and straight up, like, eat a ton of beef. Eat ground beef in particular is very easy to digest if you're in some kind of autoimmune flare. And I'd have them, we would work on the gut as well at the same time. But when I went more strict carnivore, I ended up actually having very, very loose stools, and I just couldn't get around it. I knew my microbiome was shifting. I knew I was having a die-off reaction. I knew all of that, but it still was really uncomfortable, and it seemed to be prolonged. And Dr. John Kim was like, take the butyrate, take it. And I started pounding it, and lo and behold, my gut stabilized really quickly right after. And I had forgotten, we forget we're our worst doctors. We're our own worst doctors. And that's why we have friends who are smarter than us. But it was like, again, that soothing balm that kind of righted the ship for me and got me over that hump. And so that the more heavy meat-based diet was, we're doing its work, which was very helpful for the autoimmune condition. So, and I'm sure the butyrate was helping as well.
I agree. And I think it's critically important actually for people that are on carnivore. Some people say you can get ample butyrate production from eating just meat. And we don't believe that.
I don't believe that
I don't
either.
think in today's world, like, it's just not, maybe for our ancestors, but
right.
You're talking many, many years ago.
Well, I jokingly call it the beef and blueberry diet, because that's, I make sure that we get some fiber in there from blueberries. But you're right. If people aren't getting, and I don't do great with high fiber diets, and I suppose it depends on the type of fiber, but we got to get, so butyrate is produced in our gut by our large intestine cells, like you said, just to reiterate, in the presence of these fermentable fibers. So we need the fiber in there. I don't think a high fiber diet is great for everyone. And I have seen studies saying, we don't need so much fiber. And I know the hardcore carnivores are like, you don't need any fiber. You don't need to eat any fiber. You'll be fine. But some of us do. And what I notice for me is, and for so many patients, I'm sure you've seen this too, is the gut and the brain are so intimately connected. And when my gut goes south, my brain goes right with it. And it's a mixture of brain fog, slow cognition, depression, anxiety. It's a really unpleasant experience. And I know it's all stemming from what my gut's doing at the time. And so having these tools and a knowledge base around it is really helpful to kind of right that ship. And
yeah. And I can touch on, butyrate and brain health is a pretty interesting topic. There's a study that I was recently looking at. Butyrate neuroepigenetics in the gut microbiome. Can a high fiber diet improve brain health? Now, this is talking about like a high intake of resistant starch and fiber, but what it does and what you can mimic therapeutically by taking butyrate is it emphasizes, the role that the gut-brain axis has. It pulls from the fact that it's a potent therapeutic for neurological issues due to its diverse biological functions. The mechanisms, as we talked about the HGAC inhibitor, from its role as an energy metabolite GPCR activator. I mean, it's endless. Like the neuroprotective effects of butyrate is this is one of my favorite sections of it, just talking about its role in psychological and neurodegenerative diseases. I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's critical. And if you're not eating the fiber, you got to get the butyrate somehow. That's the take home here. And that's why
fiber doesn't work for you. This is such an easy way to incorporate and get more butyrate.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we got to supplement stuff.
Yeah.
And we got to play it by ear. And that's why I'm not a big fan of telling people to have a one size fits all dietary approach. I think there's nuances. I think that, well, what I hear from my audience is, I'm doing what Dr. So-and-so says on the internet. I'm doing what this person says on the, whatever this influencer, and they get themselves so confused and spun out. And really the premise of this show is I just try, and my whole approach during COVID was like, I'm just trying to bring common sense back to the table. And again, it's individualized, right? And sometimes we got to play with things. Patients would come to me on a specific protocol saying, hey, this isn't working for me. I did some research. I found this, I found that, I'm doing this, and this is really helping. And I would learn from them, and just being open to that and realizing getting your information solely off of influencers is not always the solution. Sometimes
that's like when, that's like when L-glutamine was trending and everybody kept sending me things on TikTok saying, what's L-glutamine? And I'm like, this is not the answer to every gut health problem. Like
oh my gosh, no.
Crazy.
Well, for people not knowing what glutamine does, glutamine in the presence of adequate B6 turns into GABA, which is a really calming neurotransmitter, right? It's like an inhibitory neurotransmitter, but in the presence of not enough B6, which is super common because B6 gets sucked up by all the toxins in the environment and it gets used up very quickly. It turns into glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotoxin.
Exactly.
So when people are pounding L-glutamine, I'm like, what are you doing? I don't do well on high doses of L-glutamine at all.
I can't even touch it.
I go batshit crazy real fast. Like all of a sudden my husband's like, what is wrong with you? Oh, I've been pounding L-glutamine. It's probably
because TikTok told me to.
Yeah, because TikTok, we need t-shirts that say that. Because TikTok told me to. I love it. Let's talk about metabolic health some more and sodium butyrate's role in that and insulin sensitivity, because that's really the premise of my whole platform.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it helps to, in that role that butyrate has to close tight junctions, it also increases interleukin 10. And then also what happens is it impedes the transitions of carbohydrates to glucose. And so you've got all these different roles that it plays for metabolic function. I think the other thing that it does is it triggers the production of insulin, which helps to maintain stable blood sugar levels.
Yeah.
It also works with leptin, interestingly enough, and regulates energy balance, which is necessary for so many things, whether it's satiety or even brain function. So there's so many neurometabolic benefits to postbiotic butyrate.
I did not know it impacted leptin. And I want to talk more about that because leptin is so interesting. And I don't think people appreciate it. Leptin, when it is out of whack, or when you are dealing with leptin insensitivity, I should say, which is very common, not only is your appetite all squirrely, but that actually leads to, we have data showing that high leptin levels will definitely lead to osteoarthritis. And so we end up with, and my whole background was in joints. I did regenerative injection therapies in practice clinically. That's mainly what I did. And man, I always talk, and I've done an episode about it on here. I always talk to people like, your osteoarthritis really is metabolic syndrome of the joint. It really is diabetes of the joint. And leptin and insulin at high levels and leptin at high levels inside the joint wreak so much havoc. And so again, this takes it back to gut health, right? Like at the end of the day, we have to have the right things available to have a good, healthy gut function so that our joints don't melt. That's the simplest way to say it.
It is. And it really, there's a lot of evidence that's showing that butyrate can improve leptin sensitivity. And
that's
that can
huge.
be really beneficial for people who have leptin resistance. And leptin and butyrate are obviously both involved in weight management. And so while leptin directly influences appetite, butyrate's role in maintaining a whole kind of healthy gut microbiome and its potential effect on leptin sensitivity can also indirectly contribute to weight management.
Yeah, that's huge. Like put an exclamation point on that, because I don't think people realize that 1 in 5 patients will present to any doctor's office for pain. And most often I have found clinically that that pain is being driven. I used to tell patients to keep it simple. It's being driven by what you're putting in your mouth. And then I would gain their trust and we would do some gut testing and we would dive in further to the state of their gut. But when you get the gut in a better place, the joints definitely, that coincides very quickly. And so when your gut is off, your joints will be off. And it's when people come in and say, oh, I'm bone on bone and this is wear and tear. I'm like, no, actually it's decades of insulin resistance and leptin resistance. And this started decades ago for you. And what's your diet like? And that's a long conversation and it's hard to explain to patients, but just for everyone listening, trust us on this one. Leptin sensitivity is a big deal. And it's difficult to regulate. I mean, it's really difficult to get leptin sensitivity intact and working appropriately. So that's a whole brain gut, signaling.
And it goes back to that influence that so many different things have on that gut brain axis. And it's crucial for metabolic regulation.
Yeah. I love this. Let's talk about the balance oil for a minute, because I don't understand it as well as I should. And I know, John's really geeked out on it. So give us the spiel.
John approaches it from a perspective of somebody who has dealt with a very significant chronic illness, right? He had very significant Lyme, Bartonella, mold toxicity that led to a cardiac arrest at the age of 31. And he really had to transform his health. He was able to access doctors that helped him on that journey to learn about root causes and lipid replacement therapy and how to heal from a cellular foundation level up. John understands, and a lot of the doctors that really work very, very intimately with BodyBio products, that the seed oil argument is very myopic and very much a trendy thing and very much correlation. I actually, of all people, what's his name? BioLane. He went on a rampage the other day, about a month ago, about this myopic view we have of omega-6 and linoleic acid. Linoleic acid is 80% of the mitochondrial membrane. I mean, it is integral to our mitochondrial health. If we avoid seed oils, now there's a difference here. We'll talk about that in a second. But if we continue to avoid them at the rate that we are, people will be demyelinating. Their health will be, their cellular health will be awful, which that won't present on, in terms of like symptoms right away, but it will lead to disease, because where does disease occur? In the cells. So it's really about optimizing the ratio for cellular health of these essential fatty acids. There's a beautiful, one of my favorite biological pathways is the essential fatty acid pathway. And it's so clear that you've got linoleic on one side and you have alpha linolenic on the other, with DHA, EPA as lower level essential fatty acids. The two mothers are linoleic and alpha linolenic. And that is what balances. This is not like let's take a bunch of fish oil and it'll balance out the fried chicken you just ate or the McDonald's. It's about looking at your health, looking at your diet, avoiding the oxidized and the rancid, and optimizing with whether it's seeds or seed creams or getting it from meats or supplementing with something like BodyBio Balance Oil that's flaxseed and organic cold pressed safflower, not some gross oxidized vegetable oil sitting on a shelf in canola oil or something. There's a difference between adulterated and rancid and unadulterated. Yes. And I think that's the conversation we need to start having about seed oils. I've kind of stood back and just stayed quiet, let the doctors do the work with their patients, let them convince their patients to take the stuff. But I would say Balance Oil is one of our most prescribed products from doctors. They love it because they know it's going to provide those parent, mother essential fatty acids that are so critically important for cellular health.
Yes, thank you. That was beautifully said. I don't talk about this much publicly because it is so complicated. And unless I want to pull out those pathways and explain them from a biochemical perspective, I'm like, Oh, this is a hard conversation. And people do, they get so black and white. It's just got to be this or that. And they can't see the middle ground. And I'm like, no, it's not all or nothing, guys. We're not, just stay away from the rancid, highly, industrial produced garbage and get the right things to feed the cellular membrane, because we need the 3 6s and 9s. We need the whole thing working together.
And even like those 7s for eye health and all these beautiful fats that are so critical to our cellular health. And it's not about avoiding these things. It's about integrating them in the unadulterated forms.
Yes. Yes. And you can't, on that note, like you said, you can't offset the fried chicken with the omega-3s with the fish oil, because
I do have a trick for you though.
Okay. Well, let me say this part. I always would just tell patients, how about we avoid the crappy omega-6s so we don't need to pound so many omega-3s and others, right? That was kind of my caveat. But yes, what's the trick?
And from the pathway that the 3, like the lower level essential fatty acids, are not just going to offset the rancid 6s that you've eaten.
Right.
They don't work that. There's no cross communication there in the pathway in the body. So it doesn't work that way. But the trick, I've got a good little trick with butyrate. So the omega-6s, rancid omega-6s, are going to build something up called very long chain fats, and they accumulate in our cells as this like cellular debris.
Mm-hmm.
Butyrate breaks that down.
Oh.
So if you do go to a restaurant and you do eat some vegetable oils, take some butyrate.
Interesting. That's good to know. I love that. I'm writing this down so I have this for later. This is good. Well, it's funny because I take butyrate after a high fat meal and I feel better. So yeah, that goes in there. Yeah. We need God did not, or the universe, whatever, did not develop all of these things to be completely avoided. And it's hard. Again, this is a hard one, because if I mention seed oils or avoiding oxidized seed oils, then you have to explain what oxidized is. And you have to, people just don't you can't do it in a 400 character post on social media. It's a longer conversation. But yeah, avoiding the crappy junk we don't want canola oil. We're not talking about that here. We're talking about the appropriate omega-6s that we need to build that cellular membrane. And then that plays into metabolic health and insulin resistance and all of that jazz. So it's a bigger conversation. We do get myopic. I think we kind of have to for social media. And that's the challenging part. It's like, I tell people to eat meat and lift weights, but that's not the whole story, but that's a good starting point, right? Like it'll get you on the right path. Usually what I found though, is when people start feeling better, and like your story about the tacos, when you can start tolerating these foods more appropriately, you can start to branch out. And like, I could not handle any gluten at all for decades. I was gluten-free. And once I got my gut cleaned up after that sort of carnivore stint and then utilizing butyrate, I'm able to go out and eat and not fall apart completely, right? I have a little bit more tolerance there than I used to. I can travel without, turning into like looking like I'm 6 months pregnant with bloat after I eat a meal. So I can avoid what I know will set me off, but I also have tools available. And then I've done the gut healing to be able to tolerate these foods. And I think that does come down to better cellular health overall, having gone through that protocol and having that be helpful. I love the products. I want to talk about phosphatidylcholine too. I love phosphatidylcholine, but I'm going to let you talk about why you love phosphatidylcholine, because I think I know we mentioned it early on, but what are some more therapeutic benefits of this?
It's my favorite thing. I mean, for me as a mom, you look at your kids, you look at the world of toxic soup that we're raising them in, and there's just nothing more important to me, minerals and a healthy diet and nourishing foods. But this idea of cellular resilience in the world that we're in today, I think is so important. And I'm learning so much more just about how many things affect our health and how they affect our health. And so the more I can prioritize that as a mother, but also as kind of an educator to help more people understand this concept, is really my mission. It was my grandfather's mission. My grandfather actually wanted to turn PC into a drug, and he did not feel that people would understand what it is. He thought phosphatidylcholine will always be too technical for the general public to understand. And I think the world's different. And I think now is a time when we can talk about the technical and really look at the benefits of something, even though it seems quite esoteric talking about cellular health. But I think that the applications of PC and the ways it's being studied, both for, its role in lipid replacement therapy, for neurodegeneration, for things like autism, mold toxicity, as well as the role of just phosphatidylcholine in dementia, Alzheimer's, the role that it plays in neuronal death induced by amyloid plaques. It's extensive, and it's a really fascinating, it's not necessarily supplement, it's a biological substrate.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
It really is. Man, phosphatidylcholine, that is like it's the brain happy. Whenever anyone came to me with any kind of, and most pain, actually, when you think about my background's, like I said, in pain, most pain has a brain component, whether we like it or not. And so you see people in these sort of wind up pain phenomenons where their nervous system's wound up. We call it central sensitization, whatever you want to call it. Their nervous system is way too wound up. And I love phosphatidylcholine in those cases. It just calms the nervous system down. And again, that's why we like the egg yolks, right? And it's like you said, it's present in some meats. I think that this crazy low fat fad that happened over the decades of my life, if you look at humans now compared to when I was young and it started, clearly there was a problem there and it did not help us any. But I think a big player in that was lack of phosphatidylcholine in the diet. And that whole anti-egg movement alone was, I can put my finger on it. Plus, like we said, the advent of these processed rancid seed oils becoming, the mainstay of it's in everything. And I think we're severely lacking phosphatidylcholine. I hand it out for virtually anything and everything. And you're right. People can't wrap their heads around it. And they don't, all they can do is either feel better or not, right? And when they feel better, they get it. But phosphatidylcholine is my go-to. Whenever my brain's being funny, I'm like, bring on the phosphatidylcholine. Give it all to me. Yeah, it's good stuff. And you're right.
And
I like
there's
that.
a lot of people who think like you can take lecithin. It's different. And most phosphatidylcholine, I mean, what makes ours so unique is that my grandfather figured out a way to isolate the various phospholipids. So you have phosphatidylcholine. The majority is PC, but then you also have phosphatidylserine, part of the internet.
Yeah.
Phosphatidylethynolamine, phosphatidylinositol, and phosphatidic acid. And so you have that balance. A lot of people will say, oh, well, it's derived from soy. In the process of isolating those phospholipids, we remove the soy proteins, which is the estrogenic or allergenic part of the soy.
Nice.
But people say, can you do the same with sunflower? And you cannot. Sunflower has a 60% less, it's comprised of 60% less phospholipids. So you cannot get the same amount from sunflower PC.
I did not know that. I do love phosphorine too. That's
Yeah,
stuff.
But again, it's the essential fatty acid argument of balance. If you take phosphatidylserine short term, it's absolutely going to help with your memory. Longer term, it's going to offset the levels of the other phospholipids on your cell membrane. And so you want the balance. And you want this balance that's going to allow for all of them to kind of have the correct balance for your cell membrane and the ratio for your cell membrane. So that's why I think ours is so unique, is that it has that balance. And it's a proprietary formula that my grandfather figured out how to isolate and extract.
Yes, the balance is the key. That goes for anything. You can't crush a high level of something without sending everything else out of balance. And that's, at the end of the day, I mean, that's the name of the game. And so, especially when we're dealing with fatty acids, you're completely right. I see that with people who try to pound the fish oil. And I get that question all the time. How much fish oil should I take? And I'm like, oh gosh, that's a loaded question. That's, it's really.
Eat some fish.
Yeah, eat some fish. Or I carry one in my own private line that I think is a wonderful tool, but it's not something I push. And that's another conversation. There's a lot of people out there who are really anti-fish oil and they really come down on it. And I get it. I get their argument. At the same time, I think it comes back to what you just said, though. I think it's when we start sending things out of balance that we run into problems. It's not that any one of these things is bad for you. It's when we start imbalancing the system and imbalancing the cellular membranes and that fatty acid bilayer, it's when we get into trouble. So,
yeah.
Anything else? Did we cover everything we wanted to talk about? I feel like
I think we've covered a lot.
I think we covered it. I think I asked you all my questions. I was really excited to talk to you. And I had this whole laundry list I wanted to chug through. And I've seen you on some other podcasts. And I was like, I'm going to pick this girl's brain. This is great. Well, I love it. Where can people find out more? Let's send them to the places. Where are all the places, the social medias, the website?
Everything's at BodyBio, bodybio.com, and all of our social handles are at BodyBio. And of course, I always have to say this is not medical advice.
Of course.
As always, please refer back to your healthcare provider and talk to them before making any changes in your supplement or dietary regime.
I agree. And that's not just a disclaimer, guys. Like, that's actually really a good idea.
Yeah.
Again, you can start playing with supplements and get yourself into a lot of trouble if you go full bore in one direction too far. So I am a big fan of working with somebody who actually knows what they're doing with these products and can get you set in the right direction. So, well, this has been really fascinating. I wish I could have met your grandpa. I'm so excited to meet you, but he sounds like such a fascinating guy. How lucky are you to have that in your family?
I very much was. It's a family business that we continue. My husband's the CEO, and we have so many family members that work with us. And we're really fortunate for that because we're able just to continue his legacy.
I love it. I love it. This has been so great. Well, thank you so much, Jess, for coming on the show today. We will make sure everything's hooked up in the show notes, all the links appropriately. And I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.